The wind in Sierra Blanca never rested. It was a miserable, whining thing that scraped dust from the cracked earth and flung it against anything that dared to stand. It soughed through the sagging porch roofs, moaned along the newly strung lines of barbed wire fencing that shimmered like cruel promises in the heat, and carried the scent of dry grass, horse manure, and hopelessness. In the late summer of 1878, during a drought that had baked the land to the color of old bone, water was spoken of in whispers, like a prayer or a secret treasure. The town itself was little more than a collection of weary buildings huddled together against the vast, empty plains, a saloon whose swinging doors slapped in the endless wind, a sprawling livery stable, a plain wooden church with a leaning steeple, and a jail that looked one good storm away from surrendering to gravity. May Delgado knew the sound of that wind better than any human voice. It had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember. At 24 years old, she carried the West on her skin, not just in the sun-darkened tone of her hands or the fine lines squinting from the corners of her eyes, but in the scar. It was a story told in raised, silvered flesh, a jagged map that began at her left temple, sliced diagonally across her cheek, and disappeared into the collar of her worn cotton dress. It was the ghost of a wagon fire that had stolen her parents and marked her for life. In Sierra Blanca, a place where nicknames stuck like burrs to a saddle blanket, she was not May. She was Scar May. The name was a stone thrown at her a dozen times a day, but she had long ago learned not to flinch. Resilience was a muscle, and hers was the strongest one she had. She was a survivor, tough and fiercely practical. She mucked stalls at the livery, mended canvas for wagoners, and took any work that paid, all while harboring a quiet, desperate hunger for something more. She longed for a day when her hands were not permanently grimed with dirt, for the quiet peace of a book, for the simple dignity of a roof she could call her own, a place where the wind did not sound like it was trying to claw its way inside. On this particular scorcher of an afternoon, the livery stable was the center of the town's universe. An auction was underway, and men from 50 miles in every direction had come to bid on livestock. The air was thick with the smell of animals, sweat, and cheap tobacco. May was hauling buckets of water, a precious commodity she portioned out with the care of an apothecary measuring medicine. Her movements were efficient, wasting no motion, her face set in a neutral mask that concealed the constant, low hum of her awareness. She saw everything. She saw Coulter Remington lean against a support beam near the auctioneer's block, a head taller than most men there. At 32, he was the owner of Remington Cattle, an empire he had built from nothing but his own sweat and savvy. He wore his wealth the way he wore his hat, without fuss or fanfare. His boots were scuffed. His denim trousers faded from long days in the saddle, but the leather of his gun belt was supple and well cared for, and the quiet authority in his stance was unmistakable. He had a face carved by sun and wind, a firm jaw, and eyes the color of a stormy sky that missed nothing. He was watching the proceedings with a detached interest, his presence a solid, grounding force amidst the boisterous crowd. And May saw Blythe Calder, perched on a high stool near the stable office like a vulture on a throne. Blythe owned the Silver Serpent Saloon, the gambling hall, and, it was whispered, most of the souls in Sierra Blanca. She was a handsome widow in her 40s, always dressed in severe, expensive black silk that seemed to absorb the light around her. Her power was a palpable thing, a dark web woven from debt, secrets, and the two men who were never far from her side. Rafe, a bull of a man with a sneer permanently etched on his face, stood to her right. To her left was Jonas, silent and watchful, his stillness more menacing than any of Rafe's loud threats. Lounging near the entrance, polishing a badge that was more ornament than symbol of justice, was Sheriff Pike, a man whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder, and Blythe had long since bought and paid for it. The horse auction was winding down when Blythe slid gracefully from her stool. The auctioneer, a man who knew which side his bread was buttered on, fell silent. Blythe's voice, though not loud, cut through the low murmur of the crowd. "Gentlemen," she began, a small, unpleasant smile playing on her lips. "We have one final item up for bid today. Not livestock, but an investment in labor." A confused rustle went through the crowd. May froze, the wooden handle of the bucket digging into her palm. She knew that tone. It was the sound of a spider tightening its web. Blythe gestured with a flick of her wrist toward May. "This is May Delgado. Some of you know her. She has been under my employ, residing in a room I so generously provided. However, she has fallen behind on her rent, significantly behind." It was a lie. May worked off her rent at the saloon, scrubbing floors and washing glasses until her fingers were raw. A verbal agreement Blythe now chose to forget. "According to the statutes of this territory," Blythe continued, her eyes glittering with malice, "a debt of labor can be transferred. I am therefore offering her employment contract for sale to the highest bidder. The winner will acquire her services until her debt to me, which I calculate at a generous $50, is fully repaid." A wave of shock, followed by a ripple of cruel laughter, spread through the stable. This was not a slave auction, not legally, but it felt sickeningly close. It was a public shaming, a demonstration of Blythe's absolute power. Men whistled and catcalled. Someone yelled, "What'll you give me for the scarred side?" Blythe. May stood rooted to the spot, the dust and heat and noise fading into a dull roar in her ears. Humiliation was a fire licking up her spine. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her feet were leaden. She lifted her chin, her gaze locking with Blythe's, refusing to show the fear and rage that churned in her gut. Sheriff Pike shifted his weight, looking deliberately bored, a clear signal that this transaction, however distasteful, had his blessing. Rafe grinned, enjoying the spectacle. Jonas just watched May, his eyes as cold and empty as a snake's. "Do I hear an opening bid?" Blythe purred. "Think of it, gentlemen. A strong back for mending fences, cooking, cleaning." $5, a grimy-looking prospector called out, followed by a burst of laughter. 10 shouted another. It was then that Colter Remington pushed himself off the post. He moved with an unhurried grace that drew every eye. He walked to the center of the clearing, stopping a few feet from Blythe. He did not look at May. His gaze was fixed on the saloon owner. The crowd quieted. This was a confrontation between the two biggest powers in the county, the land baron and the queen of the town. "What is the debt, Mrs.?" Calder Coulter's voice was low and even, devoid of emotion. Blythe's smile tightened. This was not the game she had intended to play. $50, Mr. Remington. As I said, Coulter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Without a word, he counted out several gold coins into his palm. The clink of the metal was the only sound in the cavernous stable. He walked over to Blythe and dropped the coins onto the small table beside her. They landed with a heavy, final sound. "The debt is paid," he stated. Blythe stared at the gold, then up at him, her eyes narrowing. "So, you've bought yourself a girl. Coulter, I didn't figure you for the type." A few men snickered. Coulter's expression did not change. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally sweeping over May. A quick, unreadable assessment. Then he looked back at the crowd, his voice carrying to every corner of the stable. "I paid for her freedom," he said, his words clear and sharp. "Not for a person." The silence that followed was absolute. He had not only defied Blythe, he had shamed every man who had laughed, who had placed a bid on a human being's dignity. He had drawn a line in the dust, and it was a line of decency. He gave a slight nod, more to himself than anyone, and turned to leave. "This isn't over, Remington," Blythe hissed, her voice low and venomous. She had been publicly undermined, her authority challenged. It was a slight she would not forgive. "I'll have my money and the girl, both." Coulter didn't break his stride. As he passed Sheriff Pike, the lawman spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "You shouldn't play the hero. Coulter, it's a bad habit to get into in a town like this." Coulter paused for a fraction of a second, then continued walking out into the blinding sunlight without a backward glance. The spell was broken. The crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. The auction was over. Rafe shot May a look of pure hatred before following Blythe back toward the Silver Serpent. May was left standing alone in the middle of the stable, the bucket still clutched in her hand. The sting of humiliation was slowly being replaced by a bewildering sense of confusion. She was free. The word felt foreign, fragile. She looked toward the stable door, at the empty space where Coulter Remington had stood. He had paid her debt and walked away. No instructions, no expectations, no claims. He had simply cut her chains and left. She took a shaky breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. For the first time in a very long time, she had no idea what was going to happen next. The wind howled outside, kicking up a swirl of dirt in the doorway, a harbinger of the storm that had just been unleashed. She did not move for a long time after the dust from Coulter Remington's departure had settled. The men who remained avoided her eyes, shuffling away with a new kind of discomfort. His act of defiance had made her not just an object of pity or scorn, but something more complicated, a symbol. And being a symbol was just as dangerous as being a target, gathering the few meager belongings she owned from the tiny, airless room behind the saloon. She slipped out the back of the livery, expecting to be a ghost vanishing into the oppressive heat of the plains. Instead, she found him waiting. Coulter Remington sat atop a solid bay horse, holding the reins of another, a smaller buckskin with a patient demeanor. He was not looking at her, but toward the endless horizon, as if he were simply resting. Yet she knew, with the certainty of a creature long hunted, that he was aware of her every step. "I do not need a ride," she said, her voice raspy from the dust and disuse. Her worldly possessions were tied in a single kerchief. He finally turned his gaze to her. It was direct, without pity. "Where are you headed?" "East." It was a lie. A direction as good as any other. East was away. "There is nothing east of here for 100 miles but drought and dust," he stated, not as a challenge, but as a fact. "The next town is 3 days' walk, if you are lucky." "I have been lucky before." "That luck cost $50 today," he replied, his tone still perfectly even. "Get on the horse, Miss Delgado." "I am not leaving you here for Blythe's men to find." Pride was a luxury, and hers had already been stripped bare and paraded through the town. Survival was all that was left. Without another word, she walked to the buckskin, slung her small bundle over the saddle horn, and mounted. She was a capable rider, her movements fluid and sure, a fact that did not escape his notice. They rode out of Sierra Blanca without speaking. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the heat. May kept her eyes forward, her back straight. She was acutely aware of him riding beside her, a solid, quiet presence. He did not try to make conversation, for which she was grateful. He simply led the way, his path sure and steady, away from the town and into the vast, gray-green expanse of his own land. The Remington Ranch appeared first as a dark line on the horizon, then slowly resolved into the shape of buildings. It was not a grand estate. It was a place of work, built to withstand the elements, not to impress visitors. A long, low ranch house with a wide porch sat nestled amongst a stand of cottonwoods that looked thirsty but determined. Barns and corrals spread out from there, enclosed by weathered split-rail fencing. Dominating it all was a tall windmill, one of its blades slightly askew, turning with a steady, rhythmic creak that sounded like a weary sigh. As they dismounted in the yard, a woman came out of the cookhouse, wiping her hands on a large apron tied around a formidable frame. She had a kind, weathered face and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Coulter," "You are late for supper," she said, her voice a mix of warmth and scolding. Her eyes fell on May, taking in the worn dress, the defiant posture, and the scar. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And you have brought a guest. The poor thing looks half-starved." "This is Miss Delgado, Daisy," Coulter said. "She will be staying for a while." Before May could object, a lanky youth of about 18 came jogging over from the stables. He had a shock of sandy hair and a face full of freckles. "Boss, that new mare threw a shoe again," he announced, then stopped short when he saw May. He flushed slightly and ducked his head. "Ma'am." "Huck, see to Miss Delgado's horse," Coulter instructed. "Daisy, find her something to eat." He was giving orders about her as if she were a parcel, and her temper flared. "I am not staying," she said, her voice sharp. Both Daisy and Huck looked at her, surprised. Coulter turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Then you are free to go." He gestured to the sprawling, empty land around them. "The road is that way." It was not a threat, but another plain statement of fact. Her shoulders slumped slightly. He had her, and he knew it. Just then, another figure emerged from the largest barn. A woman of about 40 with intelligent, discerning eyes and capable hands. She carried a leather medical bag. "The fever broke on that calf." "Coulter," she said. Then her professional gaze settled on May, noting the scar with a clinical interest that was somehow less offensive than the stares of others. "Good to hear. Dr. Tamsin," Coulter nodded. May watched the quiet efficiency of the place, the easy way they all interacted. It was an orderly world, a world of purpose. It was everything she had ever wanted. Later, after she had eaten a bowl of Daisy's thick, savory stew in the quiet of the cookhouse, Coulter found her by the corral. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. "I meant what I said," May began, unwilling to let him think she had surrendered. "I will not be a charity case. I will work off the $50 and then I will be on my way." "I have already forgotten the $50, he said, leaning against the fence beside her. He was not looking at her, but at his herd of cattle, dark shapes moving slowly in the distance. "But I can always use another hand. The tack in the barn is in constant need of mending. The supply inventory is a mess. I will pay you $1 a day, plus room and board in the bunkhouse with Daisy. You stay as long as you like. You leave when you want. It is a job. Miss Delgado, nothing more." She studied his profile in the fading light. It was a hard face, but there was no cruelty in it. He was offering her a deal. Not a handout. It was a subtle distinction, but it was everything. "Most men would not want someone who looks like me working for them," she said, the words costing her. He turned his head then, and his eyes met hers. For the first time, he looked directly at her scar. He did not flinch or look away. He simply acknowledged it, as if it were no different than the color of her hair. "I am not most men," he said. "I care about what a person can do, not what has been done to them. Can you handle the work?" "I can handle the work," she confirmed, a spark of her old fire returning. "Good," he said, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we have an agreement." The first night was the hardest. Daisy showed her to a small, clean room at the back of the main house. It had a real bed with a quilt, a small window, and a door that locked. It was more luxury than May had known in years, and it terrified her. She lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the nicker of a horse, the groan of the windmill. Dependency was a cage, and she felt the bars closing in around her. Sometime deep in the night, a sound pulled her from a light. Troubled sleep. It was a soft noise, the scrape of a boot on gravel where there should be silence. Years of sleeping with one ear open had honed her senses. She rose silently, pulling on her dress, and slipped to the window. In the pale moonlight, she saw nothing, but she could feel a presence. It was a predator's instinct, a feeling of being watched. She crept out the back door, moving through the shadows like a wraith. Near the main storage barn, she smelled it, a faint, acrid scent of a hastily extinguished fire. Her eyes scanned the ground, and then she saw it. Tucked beside one of the large support posts was a small, neat pile of 3 stones, one atop the other. It was deliberate, too deliberate to be natural. It was a sign, a marker. Her blood ran cold. She backed away into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stayed there for what felt like an hour, a silent statue, until the feeling of being watched finally faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. The next morning, she found Huck in the stables, brushing down a big roan. She tried to make her voice sound casual. "Huck, you ever find rocks stacked up around here, little piles? Maybe 3 high?" He stopped brushing and turned to her, his young face suddenly pale under his freckles. "Where did you see it?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "By the storage barn last night?" He swore under his breath, a grown-up curse that sounded strange coming from his boyish mouth. "That is Rafe," he said, glancing nervously toward the open stable doors. "That is his way. It is a marker. It means they were here. It means they are watching the place." The confirmation settled like a stone in her stomach. Blythe was not going to let this go. Coulter had not bought her freedom. He had only bought her a place at the center of a new war. Later that afternoon, while she was alone in the tack room, the familiar smell of leather and oil filling the air. The tension of the last 24 hours finally caught up with her. Her hands trembled as she tried to thread a needle with a strip of rawhide. The feeling of being watched, the little pile of stones, the memory of Blythe's hateful smile. It all churned inside her. The fear brought with it another, older memory, the smell of smoke. Not from a small fire, but a raging inferno, the heat, the screams, the splintering wood of the wagon. Unconsciously, her hand went to a small, hidden pocket sewn into the inside of her dress. Her fingers closed around her only true possession. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, or what was left of it. It had belonged to her father, the wagon driver. It was stiff, the edges charred and brittle. Most of the pages were fused together, but a few in the middle were partly legible. She pulled it out, her hands tracing the warped cover. She opened it to the one page she could read, a page she had stared at 1,000 times over the years. It was a list of some kind, her father's neat handwriting distorted by heat and water damage. There were names of towns, dates, and next to them, a series of strange symbols. They looked like cattle brands, but they were wrong. Twisted versions of real brands she had seen. One was a circle with a jagged line through it. Another was a set of parallel lines with a cross at the end. She had always thought they were just his personal shorthand, doodles. But now, looking at them with the cold certainty of Huck's fear still fresh in her mind, a terrible thought began to form. The fire had not been an accident. An accident did not need a cover-up. These symbols, this book, it was evidence of something worth killing for. A shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up with a start, tucking the book away in a flash of guilt and fear. It was Coulter, holding 2 steaming tin cups. He walked in and handed one to her without a word. It was coffee, black and strong. He did not ask what she was doing, or why she looked like she had seen a ghost. He just leaned against the wall, sipping his own coffee, sharing the small space with her in a comfortable silence. It was a simple gesture, but it felt profound. It was a quiet offering of peace in the middle of a gathering storm. She wrapped her scarred hands around the warm cup. The heat, a small, solid anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. The scar on her face was a map of her past, but she was beginning to realize that the charred book in her pocket might be the map to a truth far more dangerous. The days at the Remington Ranch settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the animals. May worked with a quiet, fierce dedication. her hands finding a new purpose in the familiar tasks of mending leather and organizing supplies. She spoke little, but she watched everything, learning the routines and the people. She saw the easy camaraderie between Huck and Daisy, the deep, unspoken respect everyone had for Dr. Tamsin, and the steady, grounding presence of Coulter himself. He treated her with a practical courtesy that was more valuable than any kindness. He gave her tasks, expected them to be done well, and never once mentioned the $50 or the scene at the livery. A week after her arrival, the ranch's supply of salt was running low, and Coulter needed another several spools of the viciously effective new barbed wire to secure a pasture near the creek bed. A trip to town was unavoidable. He asked May to accompany him, explaining with straightforward logic that her meticulous inventory of the supplies shed meant she knew exactly what was needed better than he did. It was a reason she could not argue with, though the thought of returning to Sierra Blanca made her stomach clench. The town looked just as weary and wind-scoured as when she had left. As they tied the wagon outside the general store, May felt the familiar weight of eyes upon her. Whispers followed them like the dust devils that danced down the main street. Coulter seemed oblivious, his long strides eating up the boardwalk, but May knew he was aware of every glance. They were just about to enter the store when a hulking figure blocked their path. It was Rafe, Blythe Calder's enforcer. He was flanked by two other hard-faced men from the Silver Serpent, and he was smiling a wide, ugly smile. "Well, look what we have here," Rafe drawled, his eyes fixed on May. He deliberately let his gaze travel over her scar, lingering on it with theatrical disgust. "Remington, I did not know you were so desperate you had to start buying damaged goods." The men with him chuckled. Passers-by on the street slowed their pace. Sensing a confrontation, May felt a hot flush of shame, the old, familiar burn. But then something else rose in its place, a cold, hard anger. She had spent a week being treated like a person. She was not going to let this man drag her back into being an object of scorn. Before Coulter could even tense, May took a small step forward. She looked Rafe directly in the eye, her own expression as placid as a frozen pond. "My mark came from a fire," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the sudden quiet. "Yours comes from being a coward." A collective gasp went through the small crowd of onlookers. Rafe's smile vanished, replaced by a dark flush of fury. His hand twitched toward the pistol on his hip. Coulter moved then, not with speed, but with an immense, deliberate weight. He did not draw his weapon. He simply shifted his stance, placing himself slightly in front of May. It was a subtle movement, but the message was as clear as a gunshot. Rafe looked from May's unshakable calm to Coulter's granite stillness, and his bravado wavered. He was a bully, not a fool. Taking on Coulter Remington in the middle of town was a bad bet. With a final, venomous glare, he spat on the dusty boards of the boardwalk. "This is not over," he snarled, before turning and shoving his way back toward the saloon. Coulter watched him go, his face impassive. Then he turned to May. He did not praise her or comment on her courage. He just nodded toward the store. "We still need that salt," he said. But as they walked inside, away from the prying eyes of the town, she saw a new light in his eyes. It was respect, raw and undiluted. That evening, the mood at the ranch was tense. News of the confrontation had ridden back with them, a silent passenger in the wagon. After supper, May found Dr. Tamsin on the porch, cleaning her medical instruments by the light of a lantern. The doctor's hands were steady and precise. May hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. She could not carry the weight of her father's book alone any longer. "Dr. Tamsin," she began, her voice low, "may I ask you for some help? It is not a medical matter." Tamsin looked up, her intelligent eyes curious. "Of course, May, what is it?" May pulled the charred notebook from its hidden pocket. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed it over. "This was my father's," I was wondering about these marks. She pointed to the page with the strange, brand-like symbols. Tamsin took the fragile book with care. She held it closer to the lantern light, her brow furrowed in concentration. She ran a gentle finger over the symbols. For a long minute, she was silent. "Where did you say the wagon fire happened?" Tamsin finally asked, her voice carefully neutral. "About 10 years ago, on the trail north of the Cimarron." "May," the doctor said, looking up from the book, her expression grim. "These are not just doodles. They are rustlers' marks, ghost brands. They are used to mark stolen cattle, to make them difficult to trace before the brands can be altered with a running iron. This one," she pointed to the circle with the jagged line. "That is the mark for a herd to be held at Crowsplit Canyon. It is a box canyon east of here, a perfect place to hide stolen livestock." The world seemed to tilt beneath May's feet. Crowsplit Canyon. The name was a whisper of dread. "My father, he was a wagon driver. He hauled freight." "And sometimes," Tamsin said gently, "freighters are paid well to look the other way, or to haul supplies for outfits that do not want their business known. Or sometimes, they see something they are not supposed to see." The unspoken implication hung in the air between them, thick and poisonous. The fire, the symbols. Blythe Calder's operation was not just about trapping people in debt. It ran much deeper. It was possible Blythe had ordered the wagon burned to destroy a witness and his ledger. Her father had not died in an accident. He had been silenced. The scar on May's face was not just a burn. It was a byproduct of murder. The next few days were a blur of hard work. But for May, a new, grim purpose settled over her. The drought held its grip on the land, and the ever-present threat of a prairie fire was a constant anxiety. One afternoon, Coulter asked her to ride with him to check the northern fence line, where the grass was driest, the air was still and suffocating, and the sky had taken on a strange, yellowish cast. They were a mile from the ranch house when the wind began to rise. Not the usual whining complaint, but a low, menacing roar. On the horizon, a wall of reddish-brown dust was building, churning and climbing toward the sky. "Dust storm," Coulter said, his voice tight. "We need to get back." But it was too late. The storm hit them with the force of a physical blow, a blinding, choking maelstrom of sand and wind. The world disappeared. Visibility dropped to near zero. Through the roar, May heard another sound, a low, rumbling thunder that was not from the sky. Stampede Coulter yelled, his voice barely audible over the wind. A herd of about 50 steers, panicked by the storm, was running blind, directly toward a deep, rock-filled gully. In the chaos, May's mind went sharp and clear. Years of living on the move, of reading the land for survival, took over. She spurred her horse, pulling her kerchief up over her nose and mouth, and rode hard. Not away from the cattle, but alongside them. "There is a shallow crossing," she shouted to Coulter, pointing into the swirling dust. "Downstream, we have to turn them." He did not question her. He saw the certainty in her eyes and trusted it. Together, they rode into the edge of the panicked herd. It was dangerous, terrifying work. A horse could stumble, a rider could be unseated and trampled in seconds. But May was fearless. She rode like a demon, her smaller buckskin nimble and sure-footed. She used her body, her voice, her sheer force of will, to press against the lead steers, slowly, relentlessly, turning them from their path of destruction. Coulter was on the other side, a solid wall of pressure, mirroring her movements. Slowly, incredibly, the herd began to shift direction. May guided them toward the sound of the creek she knew was there, forcing them down the gently sloping bank and through a stretch of shallow water that broke their panicked run. On the other side, they began to slow, milling about in confusion as the worst of the dust storm passed over them. Breathing heavily, her clothes and hair caked with red dust, May watched the cattle settle. Coulter rode up beside her. He was just as grimy, but his face was filled with an undisguised awe. He looked at her, at the small, scarred woman who had just faced down a stampede and won. "How did you know about that crossing?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "My father taught me to read the shape of the land by the sound of the wind," she said simply. He just shook his head, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his hard features. In that moment, the distance between them, the $50, the arrangement of employer and employee, it all dissolved into the dust-filled air. He saw her, not Scar May, not the woman he had rescued, but May Delgado, a survivor of immense skill and courage. That night, Coulter Remington rode out from the ranch alone. He did not take the main road but cut across the open range, his path guided by the stars. He rode for over an hour until he reached a small, isolated cabin tucked into a rocky outcrop, nearly invisible against the dark landscape. An old man sat on the porch, so still he seemed carved from the rock itself. He was Cheyenne, with a face like a dried riverbed and eyes that held the wisdom of generations. This was Silas Gray, a man who lived between worlds, a tracker who could read a story from a single broken twig. Coulter dismounted. "Silas," he said by way of greeting. "Remington," Silas replied, his voice a low rasp. "A storm is coming, not the one that passed today." "It is here already," Coulter said. He sat on the porch step, the two men sharing a long silence. Finally, Coulter spoke of the notebook, of the ghost brands, of Crowsplit Canyon. He did not speak of May's scar, but he spoke of the fire, and of the woman who had survived it. Silas listened, his ancient eyes fixed on the distant horizon. When Coulter was finished, he nodded slowly. "Blythe Calder's roots run deep, and they are poisoned," he said. "She moves stolen cattle through that canyon every spring and fall. Pike gets his share to look the other way. I need evidence." "Silas," Coulter said, "something a judge will listen to." "The land holds its own evidence," Silas murmured. "It does not lie. I will listen to what it has to say." He rose, a surprisingly agile movement for a man his age. "You have put yourself in the center of her web, Remington, and you have pulled that girl in with you." "She was already there," Coulter said quietly. "I am just trying to find a way out for both of us." Silas looked at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. "Be careful," he said. "Justice in this land is often paid for in blood." Coulter nodded, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the ranch, the wind carrying the old tracker's warning with him. The game had changed. It was no longer about just protecting May. It was about tearing Blythe Calder's rotten empire down to its very foundations. Silas Gray moved through the broken country leading to Crowsplit Canyon with a silence that was unnerving. He read the trail not with his eyes alone, but with some deeper instinct, a way of feeling the land's disturbance. Coulter rode a few paces behind him, his face set like stone, his hand never far from the butt of his Winchester. Huck, trying to emulate Coulter's grim professionalism, looked more nervous than resolute, his youthful eagerness clashing with the palpable sense of danger. May brought up the rear, the dry air feeling heavy in her lungs. Every shadow looked like a threat, every rock a potential hiding place. The canyon itself was a deep, jagged wound in the earth, its high rock walls seeming to lean inward, eager to swallow them whole. They left the horses tethered in a hidden alcove and proceeded on foot. Silas held up a hand, and they all froze. He pointed toward a narrow opening, almost invisible from a distance. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low whisper of the wind funneling through the rocks. It was a perfect trap. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the whine of a ricochet. They dove for cover, the surprise complete and devastating. Gunfire erupted from the rocks above them, pinning them down. It was an ambush, perfectly planned and executed. "Jonas!" Coulter bit out, pressing himself against a boulder. He had recognized the cold efficiency of the attack. Another shot struck the rock near Silas's head, sending stone fragments flying. The old tracker grunted in pain, clutching his arm where a piece of shrapnel had torn through his sleeve. It was a shallow wound, but it was bleeding freely. "Huck, stay down!" Coulter yelled. But the boy, driven by a panicked mix of fear and a desire to prove himself, raised his head to barb it back. It was the mistake the ambushers had been waiting for. Two men seemed to materialize from the rocks, descending on Huck before he could react. He got off one wild shot before they were on him, one man clubbing the rifle from his hands while the other wrestled him to the ground. They dragged him, struggling, back into the shadows of the rocks. "Do not shoot," a voice called out. Jonas's voice, flat and devoid of emotion, or the boy dies. The gunfire ceased. An awful silence descended once more. Coulter's face was a mask of fury and frustration. They were caught. To fight meant sacrificing Huck. To surrender meant walking into Blythe Calder's hands. And then, as if summoned by the thought, she appeared. Blythe walked into the clearing from the mouth of the canyon, not with a weapon, but with a burning torch held high. The afternoon sun was bright, but the flame seemed to suck the light out of the air. A malevolent orange eye. She moved with a slow, theatrical grace. Jonas and two other hired guns flanking her. They had Huck between them, his face pale with terror, a trickle of blood running from his temple. Blythe's eyes found May, who was crouched behind a rock near Coulter. A slow, cruel smile spread across Blythe's face. She walked forward until she was only 20 feet away, the heat from the torch rolling off her in waves. "Well, Scar May," Blythe said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Does this bring back memories? The heat, the smell of smoke. It suits you." May felt the air leave her lungs, the sight of the open flame, the smell of burning pitch. It was a physical assault. The canyon walls seemed to be closing in, the heat pressing on her skin, and for a terrifying second she was 10 years old again, trapped in a burning wagon, the world a roaring inferno. "Let the boy go, Blythe," Coulter said, his voice a low growl. "This is between you and me." "Oh, everything is between you and me, Coulter, dear," she purred. "But she is the one who started it. She and her pathetic father, poking his nose into business that was not his concern. He had a ledger, you know," she said, her eyes fixed on May, full of little marks. He thought he was so clever. Fire is such a wonderful way to erase mistakes. Is it not? It leaves its own little marks instead. She gestured toward a pile of dry brush and straw near where they held Huck. It had been soaked in oil. The intent was horrifically clear. "You see," Blythe continued, her voice taking on a sing-song quality of madness, "I believe in lessons, and the lesson for today is that those who bear the mark of fire are destined to return to it. We will start with the boy. I think a little bonfire to jog your memory." One of the men shoved Huck forward, toward the oil-soaked pyre. The boy stumbled, his eyes wide with disbelief. This was not a gunfight. It was a ritual of pure cruelty. May was frozen, trapped in the nightmare of her past. But as she saw the raw terror on Huck's face, something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but the paralysis of fear. The memory was not just of pain, it was of survival. In that same instant, Coulter acted. With a roar of pure rage, he launched himself not at the gunman, but at a tall, precariously balanced rock pillar at the edge of the clearing. He hit it with all his weight, a desperate, impossible gamble. The pillar teetered for a heart-stopping second, and then it fell, crashing down with a sound like thunder, sending an avalanche of rock and dust cascading toward Jonas and his men. It was the only diversion they would get, in the chaos of dust and shouting. May ripped off her heavy canvas jacket. She ran to a small puddle of stagnant water trapped in a hollow rock, soaking the garment. As the gunmen scrambled away from the rockfall, their attention momentarily broken. May ran forward. She flung the wet jacket over the oil-soaked straw just as Blythe's torch descended. The flame hit the wet canvas with a hiss and a plume of steam instead of a roar of ignition. At the same moment, May grabbed Huck's arm, pulling him with a strength she did not know she possessed. "Run!" she screamed. They scrambled back toward the cover of the rocks as Coulter laid down a volley of covering fire from his Winchester. Silas, his arm bleeding but his aim still true, added his own pistol shots to the fray. Blythe shrieked in frustration. Her perfect, sadistic theater ruined, under the cover of the dust and gunfire. They retreated, dragging the wounded Silas and the terrified Huck with them, vanishing back into the broken landscape from which they had come. The ride back to the ranch was a long, grim, and silent affair. They had escaped, but they had not won. They had seen the true, monstrous face of Blythe's operation. When the familiar shape of the windmill finally appeared against the darkening sky, a collective sigh of relief went through them. They were home. They were safe. But the smell of smoke reached them before they even cleared the last rise. It was the wrong kind of smoke, not the comforting scent of Daisy's cook fire, but the sharp, angry smell of a structure fire. They spurred their tired horses, their hearts pounding with a new and terrible dread. They topped the rise and saw it. A section of the main storage barn was engulfed in flames, a furious orange glow against the twilight. While they had been fighting for their lives in the canyon, Blythe's retribution had already arrived. The next hour was a frantic, desperate battle. Everyone, even the wounded Silas and the shaken Huck, joined the Bucket Brigade. They fought the fire with a grim determination, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. They managed to save the main part of the barn, but a large section, the one that held the winter feed and the new seed for the spring crop, was a total loss. The future of the coming season, the lives of the calves yet to be born, was now in jeopardy. When the last of the flames had been beaten down into a smoldering, sullen ruin, a profound exhaustion settled over them all. The spirit of the ranch, its sense of sanctuary and strength, had been broken. They stood in the dark, staring at the smoking black skeleton of the barn, a monument to their defeat. May wandered away from the group, her body moving on autopilot. The smell of ash and charred wood was thick in her throat, a taste she knew too well. She stopped near the corral, the devastation of the barn silhouetted against the moon, the terror from the canyon, the ghost of the torch in Blythe's hand, the sight of the fire devouring their home. It all crashed down on her at once. The hard shell she had built around herself over 10 years of survival shattered into a million pieces. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of a pain too long suppressed. She sank to her knees, the dust puffing up around her. The tears she had refused to shed for a decade finally came, hot and unstoppable. She wept for her father, for the life that had been stolen from her, for the boy they had almost lost, for the home that was now scarred and broken. She cried until she was empty, until there was nothing left but a hollow, aching grief. She did not know how long he had been standing there, but when she finally looked up, Coulter was there, his face dark and unreadable in the moonlight. He did not move to touch her. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just stood and waited, letting her grief run its course. When her sobs had finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he spoke, his voice low and rough. He did not look at the ruin of his barn, but at her. "We rebuild," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of intent, as solid as the earth beneath them. "First light. We start clearing the debris. We have to get a new fence line up before the first snow to protect the remaining hay." He paused, and she could feel his gaze on her, steady and intense. He was not looking at her with pity. It was something else, something that felt like an anchor. "We are going to need someone to run the fencing crew," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. Someone who knows how to work hard and how to make others work hard. Someone who understands what is at stake. He knelt down, not to her level, but close, so she had to look him in the eye. That person is you. May, you will be in charge. She stared at him, bewildered. In her moment of absolute brokenness, he was not trying to fix her. He was handing her a hammer. He was giving her not sympathy, but responsibility. He was giving her a future to build, a task to focus on instead of the ash of the past. It was the most profound act of understanding she had ever known. Slowly, shakily, she got to her feet. The tears had left clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. She looked from the smoking ruin to his determined face. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. A tiny, defiant ember of hope had been kindled in the wreckage. "All right," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "All right, Coulter, we rebuild." The work of rebuilding began in the gray light of the following dawn. A silent, grim-faced crew moving through the ashes of their security. There was no time for mourning. Winter was a predator that stalked the plains, and they had to be ready. Coulter's words had been a spark in the darkness for May. He had given her purpose, not pity, and she seized it with the desperation of a drowning woman grabbing a rope. She directed the fencing crew, Huck and 2 other ranch hands, with a quiet authority that surprised them all. She did not raise her voice or give grand orders. She simply worked harder than any of them, her hands sure and steady as she measured post distances, stretched the vicious new wire, and hammered in the staples. She understood the geometry of a strong fence, how it had to give just enough to the wind but hold firm against a charging steer. Huck, his earlier terror replaced by a sobered maturity, watched her with a kind of hero worship. She had saved his life, and now she was teaching him how to build. There was a quiet competence about her that commanded respect more effectively than any threat. The ranch slowly began to heal. The charred timbers of the barn were cleared away. The scent of smoke gradually replaced by the clean smell of fresh-cut pine as they began to frame a new, smaller structure. Daisy's cookhouse once again became the warm, beating heart of the place, her endless supply of coffee and stew fueling their long days of labor. Dr. Tamsin divided her time between tending to Silas's arm and making quiet trips into the surrounding area, her medical bag a cover for gathering information, piecing together the scope of Blythe's network of fear and debt. For May, the physical exhaustion was a blessing. It quieted the ghosts that whispered to her in the dark. But every morning, in the first moments of consciousness, the fear and shame would return, a cold hand clutching her heart. Her first instinct upon waking was to touch her face, to feel the familiar, jagged landscape of her scar and remember why she had to keep her walls up. One morning, about a week after the fire, she rose before anyone else. The sky was just beginning to blush with the promise of dawn, and a chill hung in the air. She pulled on her clothes and slipped out to the water trough to wash her face. As she leaned over the cold, still water, she automatically pulled the corner of a rough homespun scarf up, covering the left side of her face from habit. A small, unconscious act of hiding. She was splashing the icy water on her skin when she heard the soft crunch of a boot on the gravel behind her. She did not startle. She knew his walk. Coulter stopped beside her, holding 2 steaming tin cups. He extended one to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it, a small spark of warmth in the cold air. She kept her head down, sipping the coffee, the scarf still held in place. He did not speak for a long moment, simply stood beside her, watching the eastern horizon ignite. The silence was comfortable, a shared space that needed no words. Then, his voice, low and soft, cut through the morning quiet. "Beautiful." The word was so unexpected, so simple, it seemed to hang in the air between them. May's head jerked up. She thought she must have misheard him, that he was talking about the sunrise. She gave a short, disbelieving laugh, a sound rusty from disuse. "Who are you talking to?" she asked, her tone laced with the sharp edge of her old defenses. He did not look at the sunrise. He looked directly at her, his gaze clear and unwavering, meeting her eyes over the rim of his cup. There was no artifice in his expression, no hint of a joke or a lie. He saw the scarf, and he saw the scar beneath it, and his gaze did not falter. "To the most beautiful person here," he answered, his voice steady and sincere. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting his words settle. "Every morning. I'm going to remind you of that." May stared at him, speechless. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird in a cage. No one had ever called her beautiful. They had called her Scar May. They had called her a survivor. They had called her a hard worker, but never that. The word felt like a foreign language she could not comprehend. It was a truth so contrary to everything she had ever known about herself that her mind could not accept it. And yet, the look in his eyes held no room for doubt. He finished his coffee, gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, and walked away toward the stables to begin his day, leaving her alone by the water trough with the cooling cup in her trembling hands and his impossible word echoing in her soul. She slowly, tentatively, lowered the scarf from her face, letting the cool morning air touch her scar. The morning coffee became their ritual. He never failed. Every dawn, he would find her, a silent offering of a warm cup and that one quiet word. Sometimes she would just nod. Sometimes she would manage a small, hesitant smile. She never knew how to respond. But the daily affirmation began to work on her like slow, steady rain on parched earth. It began to seep past the walls she had built, watering a part of her she thought had died long ago. She was learning to endure the kindness, to let the word sit with her instead of immediately casting it aside as a mistake or a lie. She was slowly, terrifyingly, beginning to shift from just surviving to daring to live. The legal plan was taking shape in the quiet of the ranch house after the day's work was done. Tamsin and Silas would sit with Coulter, their heads bent over maps and scraps of paper under the yellow lamplight. "I spoke to a blacksmith in the next county," Tamsin reported one night, her voice low. "He remembers a man who paid in gold for a set of custom running irons 2 years ago. The description matches Jonas." Silas, his arm now healing cleanly, pointed a long, bony finger at the map. "Her stolen herds do not go to market under her name. They are driven south to a railhead near Tascosa. She has a partner there, a man who launders the cattle, gives them a new brand and a new history. We need his name. We need the bill of sale." "I have sent a letter to Judge Morrison in the district capital," Coulter added, his jaw tight. "He is an honest man. I told him I have evidence of arson, coercion, and a rustling operation that is bleeding this entire territory dry. He is listening, but he needs more than our word. He needs proof that will stand up in court against Blythe's high-priced lawyers." The work on the new fence became their shared focus, a tangible act of defiance. It was their declaration that they would not be broken. One gray, overcast afternoon, a soft, misty rain began to fall, turning the dust to dark mud. It was a gentle rain, a promise of life for the thirsty land. They were working on the final stretch of fence, May and Coulter alone, the others having gone back to the barn for more supplies. He held the wire stretcher, his muscles straining as he pulled the barbed strand taut, while she hammered in the last few staples, her movements economical and precise. The rhythmic sound of her hammer was the only noise, a steady beat against the soft drumming of the rain on their hats. With the final strike, it was done. A new, strong, unbroken line of fence stretched as far as they could see, a silver thread stitching their land back together. A profound silence fell between them. They stood there for a long moment, side by side, looking at their shared work. The rain dripped from the brims of their hats, running in rivulets down their faces. May looked up at him, a real, unforced smile touching her lips. "It is done," she said, her voice soft. "We did it," he corrected her gently. His eyes held hers, and in them she saw a deep, quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the day and everything to do with her. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with all the unspoken words, the shared dangers, and the morning coffees. He slowly raised a hand, his calloused thumb gently brushing a drop of rain from her cheek, his touch lingering for a second on the edge of her scar. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She simply stood there, her breath caught in her throat, and let him see her. He lowered his head, his movement slow, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned into him, her eyes fluttering shut as his lips met hers. It was not a fiery, demanding kiss, but one of tenderness and certainty. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of respect, of a deep and steady recognition. It tasted of rain and coffee and the promise of home. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his chest. She could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her ear. She slid her arms around his waist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. His hand came to rest in the small of her back, a gesture of protection and possession that felt not like ownership, but like belonging. They stood there for a long time in the gentle rain, wrapped in an embrace that was both a beginning and a destination. Two survivors finding shelter in each other. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together. A silent, binding promise made while the healing rain washed the world clean around them. The evidence was a small, precious bundle wrapped in oilcloth May's father's charred notebook, a sworn statement from the blacksmith Tamsin had found, and Silas Gray's meticulously hand-drawn maps detailing the movement of cattle through Crowsplit Canyon. Judge Morrison had agreed to a preliminary hearing at the county seat, a full day's ride away. It was their one chance to present their case and secure formal charges against Blythe Calder. They set out at first light, a small, determined convoy. Coulter and May rode in the main wagon, the oilcloth bundle tucked safely under the seat. Silas and a sobered, quiet Huck rode escort on horseback. The air was unnaturally still, the sky a pale, washed-out blue that offered no comfort. A strange yellow haze clung to the horizon, and the wind, for the first time in weeks, was silent. "I do not like this sky," Silas said, his voice a low rumble as he rode up alongside the wagon. "The air feels borrowed." May knew what he meant. She had felt it too, a pressure in her ears, a tension in the atmosphere, as if the world were holding its breath. As the morning wore on, the yellow haze deepened, and the silence was replaced by a low, intermittent hum, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. They were halfway to the county seat, traveling through a wide, exposed plain. When the wind returned, it did not start as a breeze, but as a sudden, violent shove, nearly pushing the wagon off the faint track they were following. The sky to the west darkened with an alarming speed, not with clouds, but with a solid, churning wall of brown. "Sandstorm," Coulter said, his voice grim. He pulled the heavy canvas wagon cover forward, trying to create a small pocket of shelter. "We have to keep moving. Try to make it to the river bluffs." But the storm was moving faster than any horse could run. It descended on them with a deafening roar, a monstrous grinding sound that blotted out the sun and turned the day to a suffocating twilight. The world dissolved into a chaos of stinging, blinding sand. The wind tore at them, a physical force that threatened to rip the reins from Coulter's hands. The horses whinnied in terror, their eyes wide and rolling. The track, their only guide, disappeared in seconds. They were adrift in a featureless, howling sea of dust. Coulter fought to keep the team moving forward, but he was driving blind, relying on an instinct that was useless in this maelstrom. Huck and Silas were gone, swallowed by the storm, hopefully staying close. "We are lost!" Coulter shouted over the roar, his face a mask of dirt, his voice tight with frustration. Panic was a cold serpent coiling in the pit of his stomach. To stop was to risk being buried. To continue was to risk wandering in circles until the horses gave out. May, who had been huddled under the canvas, reached out and put a hand on his arm. He looked at her, and in the swirling gloom he could see that her eyes were not filled with fear, but with an intense, focused concentration. She had pulled her scarf up over her nose and mouth, but her gaze was sharp. Her head tilted as if she were listening to something other than the storm. "Let me," she said, her voice muffled but clear. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "Let you what?" "Drive," she said. "I can find the way." He hesitated for only a second. He looked out at the impenetrable wall of dust, then back at her calm, certain face. He had seen her skill in the stampede, had trusted her instinct then. He had no choice but to trust it now. He scooted over on the bench, handing her the thick leather reins, taking control of the team. May did not urge them forward. Instead, she slowed them to a walk, closing her eyes for a moment. She was not seeing, she was feeling. She felt the direction of the wind on her one exposed cheek, the way it shifted and eddied. She listened past the roar to the finer sounds, the high-pitched whistle as the sand scoured the rock formations she knew were to the north, the deeper groan as the wind was forced up the incline of the unseen plains to the south. Her father had taught her this, the language of a blind world. He had called it navigating by the bones of the land. "Turn left," she commanded, her voice firm. Hard left. Coulter, acting as her hands, pulled on the reins, guiding the terrified team. For what felt like an eternity, they moved through the disorienting chaos, May giving quiet, confident directions. "A little more to the right now. Keep the pull of the wind steady on your shoulder. The ground is starting to fall away. We are close." And then, miraculously, the violent pitching of the wagon smoothed out. The roar of the wind lessened slightly as they descended into the shelter of a shallow, dry arroyo. They were not out of the storm, but they were in its lee, protected by the earth itself. A few moments later, two ghostly shapes emerged from the dust. It was Silas and Huck, who had followed the wagon's tracks before they were completely erased. They had found shelter. She had saved them. They arrived at the county courthouse hours late, looking like apparitions. They were covered head to toe in a fine red powder, their faces grimy and their eyes raw. Inside the courtroom, the contrast could not have been more stark. The air was still and stuffy. Blythe Calder sat beside a portly, well-dressed man in an expensive suit, her expression one of cool composure. Sheriff Pike sat nearby, looking smug and confident. Their lawyer, a man named Abernathy from Santa Fe, rose as they entered. He looked them over with an expression of faint amusement. "Your Honor," he said in a smooth, resonant voice, "it seems the opposing party has finally decided to grace us with their presence, though they appear to have had some trouble with their grooming. Judge Morrison, a stern man with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, gave him a withering look. Save your commentary for your arguments. Mr. Abernathy, let us proceed." The hearing was a brutal affair. Abernathy was a master of insinuation and character assassination. He painted May as a troubled, unstable drifter, prone to flights of fancy. He twisted her resilience into a kind of cunning opportunism. "This is a young woman of no family and no means," Abernathy declared, pacing before the judge. "She attaches herself to the charity of my client, Mrs. Calder. And then, when her debts become too much, she concocts a fantastic story of persecution to ensnare a wealthy and perhaps lonely man, Mr. Remington." Sheriff Pike was called to testify. He lied with an ease that was chilling, claiming May had been a source of trouble in Sierra Blanca, that her debt to Blythe was legitimate, and that Coulter's payment had been nothing more than a private business matter. Finally, they called May to the stand. A low murmur went through the room as she walked forward, her worn dress caked with the dust of the storm. She took the oath, her voice quiet but steady. Abernathy approached her like a wolf circling its prey. "Miss Delgado," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "you have a very prominent scar on your face. Does such a mark not affect your state of mind? Does it not, perhaps, make you feel resentful toward a world that values beauty? It reminds me that I survived, May said simply, her eyes fixed on the judge. And you claim this fire was no accident, Abernathy pressed. You, a child of 10 at the time, believe you witnessed a conspiracy. I believe my father was killed because of what he knew, she said. And what do you want from all this? Miss Delgado, he sneered. A share of the Remington fortune. May took a deep breath. She did not look at the lawyer. She did not look at Blythe's hateful stare. She looked at Judge Morrison, her gaze direct and unwavering. The courtroom fell silent, leaning in to hear her soft voice. I want to be called by my name, she began, her words clear and deliberate. My name is May Delgado. The mark on my face came from a wagon fire that killed my parents. For 10 years, I worked any job I could find. When I worked for Mrs. Calder, she tried to sell my labor to the highest bidder to settle a debt I had already repaid with my work. Mr. Remington did not buy me. He saw an injustice, and he paid to set it right. He paid for my freedom. Her voice gained strength with every word. All I have ever wanted, Your Honor, is to do honest work, to have a roof over my head, and to learn how to read. I want the right to be a person, not a thing to be bought or sold or mocked. The simple dignity of her words was more powerful than any of Abernathy's legal theatrics. The room was utterly still. Even the judge seemed moved, his stern expression softening for a fraction of a second. It was then that Coulter's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence to present. Silas Gray moved forward from the back of the room. He was an unassuming figure, old and weathered, and Abernathy looked at him with dismissal. But when Silas unrolled the large piece of buckskin on the table before the judge, a collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was a map, intricately detailed, showing the Remington Ranch and the surrounding lands. But it also showed grazing paths and holding areas on federal land that had been illegally used and overgrazed. This map, Your Honor, Coulter's lawyer stated, shows the illegal grazing routes used by Mrs. Calder's rustling operation, routes that conveniently lead to Crowsplit Canyon. Abernathy scoffed. A crude drawing by an old man. It proves nothing. On the contrary, the lawyer said, his voice ringing with triumph. He pointed to the bottom corner of the map. It proves everything. There, at the bottom, was a signature, authorizing the use of a particular access road that crossed a corner of public land. The signature was clear, an arrogant scrawl. It read Sheriff Theron Pike. All eyes in the courtroom swiveled to the sheriff. The smug confidence drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, sickened pallor. He looked at Blythe, but her face was a mask of cold fury. He was on his own. Judge Morrison studied the map, then the signature, then looked at Pike with an expression of utter contempt. He struck his gavel once, the sound like a crack of doom. Sheriff Pike, the judge's voice boomed through the silent room. You are a disgrace to the badge you wear. I find this evidence credible and damning. Deputy, place this man under arrest for suspicion of corruption, conspiracy, and perjury. A stunned deputy rose, his face a mixture of shock and resolution, and walked toward Pike, who seemed to have been turned to stone. Furthermore, the judge continued, his gaze now fixed on Blythe Calder. In light of this evidence and the credible testimony of Miss Delgado, I am issuing a warrant for the arrest of Mrs. Blythe Calder on charges of arson, kidnapping, forced labor, and criminal conspiracy. This court will recommend prosecution to the full extent of the law. The room erupted. Blythe shot to her feet, her face contorted in a mask of disbelief and rage. But it was too late. The law, slow and ponderous, had finally turned its relentless gaze upon her. As the deputy disarmed a numb and trembling Pike, May looked at Coulter. In his eyes she saw the reflection of her own exhaustion, her own terror, and a shared, hard-won victory. The sandstorm had nearly broken them, but the storm they had unleashed in the courtroom had, for the first time, given them a real hope for justice. The chaos in the courtroom was a flash flood of noise and motion. As the deputy started toward a stunned Sheriff Pike, Blythe Calder's expensive lawyer, Abernathy, leaped to his feet, launching into a furious, meaningless objection. It was a smokescreen, a cloud of ink in the water, and it was all she needed. In the few seconds of confusion, Blythe did not wait for the law to lay its hands on her. She rose from her chair, not with a panicking scramble, but with the fluid, venomous grace of a snake, and melted into the crowd at the back of the courtroom. By the time Judge Morrison's gavel brought order and the deputy turned to arrest her, she was gone. A fast horse had been waiting in a back alley. They learned that much later. Coulter, May, and Silas stood on the courthouse steps. The victory they had won moments before turning to ash in their mouths. They had a warrant, but Blythe had the head start. She was running, but she was not retreating. She was falling back to her fortress, to her web. She was going home to Sierra Blanca. The ride back was a grim, silent pursuit of a ghost. The wind had returned, but it was different now. The storm had scoured the air clean, and what was left was a hot, dry wind that smelled of dust and desolation. It was a fire wind. It gusted and eddied, whipping May's hair and tugging at the brim of Coulter's hat. Every gust felt like a warning, a prophecy of the night to come. The land itself felt like a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. They saw Sierra Blanca as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery, apocalyptic colors. The town was deathly quiet. No children played in the street, no dogs barked. The windows of the houses were dark squares of fear. All the town's nervous energy was focused on one place, the Silver Serpent Saloon. Its doors were shut, its windows shuttered. It looked like a fortress, which was precisely what it had become. As they dismounted at the livery, the stable owner, a man who had known May for years and never offered more than a grunt, rushed out to them, his face pale. "She is in there," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Blythe! She came back an hour ago, looking like death itself. Rafe and Jonas, and a half-dozen of her hardest cases, they are all in there with her. They have rifles." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the long, deep shadows of twilight bled into true dark. The wind picked up, a steady, malevolent force that moaned through the eaves and rattled the loose sign of the general store. Coulter and Silas stood in the deep shadow of the blacksmith's shop. Studying the saloon, it was a suicide mission to rush the place. "We could try to wait them out," Coulter said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "But she will not be starved out in a week." Silas shook his head, his ancient eyes scanning the rooftops. "The wind," he murmured. "The wind is the enemy tonight. One spark, one stray shot through a window. This whole town is old, dry wood. She knows that." It was May who saw the true nature of the battlefield. While the men focused on the guns and the figures barricaded in the saloon, she was looking at the buildings huddled around it, the mercantile, the dress shop, the land office. She felt the heat of the wind on her face, and it brought back the suffocating terror of the wagon fire, the helpless rage of the ranch fire. She knew what fire did to dry wood and wind. She turned to Coulter, her eyes clear and intense in the gathering dark. "You are thinking about how to fight them," she said, her voice steady. "That is the wrong way. We have to save the town first." He looked at her, confused. "May, they are in there with rifles." "And the wind is out here with a torch," she countered. "If that place catches fire, it will take the whole street with it. We cannot let her burn everyone else's home to the ground just to save her own skin." A new understanding dawned on Coulter's face, followed by a wave of respect. She was not thinking like a victim, or even a fighter. She was thinking like a leader. "What do we do?" he asked. Her strategy was born of a lifetime of practical survival. "Water," she said. "We need every bucket in this town. We form a line from the main well. We soak the walls of the buildings on either side of the saloon. We create a wet line that the fire cannot jump. We give it nowhere to go. It was a daunting task, but it was a plan. It was hope. Slowly, cautiously, doors began to open, spurred by Coulter's authority and May's quiet, determined competence. The townspeople emerged from their homes. They were terrified. But the sight of a woman they had only ever known as Scar May organizing a defense for their town was a more powerful motivator than fear. While May directed the frantic, whispered work of the Bucket Brigade, Coulter and Silas moved like shadows through the back alleys. Their job was to contain the human threat. They could not attack, but they could watch and wait and create a cage of their own. The first sign of trouble came not as a gunshot, but as a flicker of orange light in one of the saloon's upper windows. A moment later, the flicker became a hungry glow. Whether a lantern was knocked over in a drunken argument or it was a deliberate act of spite, the result was the same. The silver serpent was on fire. The wind seized the opportunity. It howled and tore at the new flames, fanning them with a terrifying fury. Smoke, thick and black, began to pour from the windows. The fire was spreading with unnatural speed, consuming the dry, whiskey-soaked wood of the saloon. May's voice rose above the growing roar. "Calm and commanding. Keep the water on the other buildings. Do not let it jump the alley. Form a second line to the roof of the mercantile." The townspeople worked with a desperate energy, their fear forged into a single, unified purpose. They were no longer just saving their own homes. They were fighting for the soul of their town. The heat and smoke finally became too much for the men inside the saloon. The front doors burst open and two of the hired guns stumbled out, coughing and gasping, their hands raised in surrender. The fight had gone out of them. From the alley, Coulter and Silas saw more figures emerge from the back. Rafe came out last, his face a mask of rage, firing his pistol wildly into the darkness. He was a cornered beast, fighting an enemy he could not see. A single, well-aimed shot from Coulter's rifle struck the gun from Rafe's hand. Before he could recover, Silas was on him, disarming and subduing him with the swift, brutal efficiency of a lifelong hunter. Then another figure emerged from the smoke. His movements, calm and deliberate. It was Jonas. He walked a few paces into the alley, dropped his rifle in the dust, and slowly raised his empty hands above his head. His war was over. The main saloon was now a raging inferno, a tower of flame that lit up the entire town, casting dancing, demonic shadows. The heat was immense. May was directing the water line at the back of the general store, her face streaked with soot, when a figure stumbled out of the saloon's rear entrance. It was Blythe. Her fine black dress was torn. Her hair had come undone, and her face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated hatred. She saw May, and for a moment they stood there, 20 feet apart, illuminated by the fire that was consuming Blythe's empire. All of Blythe's power, her money, her control. It was all turning to ash behind her. All she had left was her venom. "Look at you," Blythe hissed, her voice a ragged shriek over the roar of the flames. "The little scarred mouse, playing with buckets of water. That mark of shame did not save you. Did it? You are still just something broken." May stood straight. The leather handle of the bucket gripped tight in her hand. She felt the heat of the fire on her skin, but it no longer terrified her. The flames held no power over her. She looked at the woman who had haunted her life, and she felt not fear, not even hatred, but a vast, weary pity. "It is not a mark of shame," May said, her voice clear and calm, carrying easily over the noise. "It is the map that led me out of hell. It taught me how to survive. It taught me how to see people like you for what you are. Thank you for showing me the way." Blythe stared at her, her mouth agape. Her cruelest weapon had just been turned into a statement of strength. Her power to inflict shame was gone. In that moment, she was truly defeated. With a snarl of pure animal rage, she turned and ran. Not away, but toward a small, detached shed behind the saloon, the liquor storeroom, one last, desperate act of destruction. In her blind fury, her foot caught on a loose cellar door. She pitched forward with a cry of pain, her ankle twisting beneath her. She was falling directly into the path of a collapsing, burning section of the saloon wall. Acting on an instinct faster than thought, an instinct to protect, not to punish, May dropped the bucket and lunged forward. She reached out her hand, a simple, human gesture of aid. "No," she cried. For a split second, their hands were inches apart. Blythe looked up, her face a contorted mess of pain, fury, and pride. She saw the offered hand, the offer of mercy from the woman she had tormented, and she could not bear it. With a final, defiant sneer, she slapped May's hand away. The burning timbers crashed down, not on her, but beside her, showering her with sparks and embers. She was not burned, but she was trapped, her escape cut off, her ankle broken. She was alive. Coulter and Silas were there a moment later, their weapons ready, but there was no fight left. Blythe Calder, the Queen of Sierra Blanca, was finally captured. She was forced to sit in the dust, her reign over, and watch as the people she had terrorized worked together, their faces grim and determined in the firelight, to save their town from the ashes of her hatred. The water of their community spirit was extinguishing the last of her fire. Justice had not come from the barrel of a gun, but from the steady, determined passing of a simple bucket of water. The dawn that followed the fire was unlike any Sierra Blanca had ever known. The air, thick with the smell of wet ash and smoke, was also filled with a strange and unfamiliar quiet. The reign of the Silver Serpent was over, and the silence it left behind was not one of fear, but of exhaustion and a dawning, fragile hope. The town had not been burned down, it had been tempered. In the wreckage of Blythe Calder's saloon, a community began to find itself. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of a new era. There was only work. People emerged from their homes, not with suspicion, but with a shared sense of purpose. They cleared debris, shared what little water they had, and spoke to each other in low, tired voices. The fire had burned away the web of whispers and isolation that Blythe had so carefully woven. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive. Blythe Calder was transported under armed guard to the district capital, her pride a cold, hard shield against the glares of the townspeople she had once terrorized. She would face a federal judge, her crimes too numerous and complex for a local court. Sheriff Pike was summarily convicted of corruption and stripped of his badge, his swagger gone, replaced by the shuffling gait of a broken man. In a surprising act of judicial wisdom, Judge Morrison sentenced Rafe and Jonas not to a distant prison, but to a year of hard labor in Sierra Blanca. Their first task was to help rebuild the granary at the Remington Ranch, their sweat and muscle a tangible form of restitution for the community they had helped to wound. In the weeks that followed, a slow, steady healing began. The most visible sign of this change was not a new building, but an idea. It started on the wide, shady porch of the Remington Ranch house. Dr. Tamsin, whose knowledge extended far beyond medicine, tacked a large slate blackboard to a post beneath the steady, creaking blades of the windmill. She and May started a school. Every afternoon, after the morning chores were done, a small, eager crowd would gather. The children of the town, some of whom had never held a book, sat on overturned crates, their eyes wide with wonder as Tamsin showed them the magic of letters. And alongside them, a handful of adults, ranch hands and shopkeepers who had lived their lives by their mark, learned the difficult, liberating art of signing their own names. May was a natural teacher. Her patience, born from a lifetime of careful observation, was endless. She moved among the students, her voice soft and encouraging, helping a child form a clumsy bee, guiding a calloused hand as it struggled to write a signature. The children were not afraid of her scar. To them, it was just a part of her, like the color of her eyes. They would trace it with a curious finger, and she would not flinch. It was here, in the simple act of teaching others to form words, that she truly began to find her own voice. One evening, as the sun set and the students departed, May sat alone on the porch steps. A new leather-bound journal and a pot of ink rested beside her. She opened it to a clean page. For years, her story had been written on her face, told by others in cruel whispers. Now, for the first time, she would write it herself. Her hand was not yet steady, but the letters she formed were clear and strong. She dipped the pen in the ink, the scratching sound a small, satisfying noise in the quiet evening. She wrote for a long time, filling the page with her thoughts, her fears, and the new, unfamiliar shape of her hopes. At the bottom of the page, as the last of the light faded, she wrote one clear, defiant sentence. My scar is the story that burned, not the face of my future. The morning ritual continued, an unspoken constant in their changing world. The dawn would break, and Coulter would find her, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. The chill of the high plains air would be a sharp contrast to the warmth of the tin cup in her hands. Their conversations were often wordless, a shared look, a small smile, an understanding that ran deeper than any spoken language. One morning, the air was particularly crisp, and the sky was a canvas of impossible, vibrant color. He found her by the newly built corral, watching the horses move in the pale light. He handed her a cup, his fingers brushing hers. He stood beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight. He watched her for a long moment, his expression soft, his eyes filled with a quiet reverence. You are beautiful, he said, the familiar words a gentle caress in the cool air. For weeks, her response had been a shy smile, a silent nod, a hesitant acceptance. But this morning was different. She had spent the night writing in her journal, finding the shape of her own thoughts, her own worth. She had faced fire and fear and had not been consumed. She had found her home, not just in this place, but within her own skin. She turned to him, and her smile was no longer hesitant. It was wide and full of a gentle, playful light. She raised an eyebrow, her eyes crinkling at the corners. I know, she said, her voice laced with a soft, teasing warmth. You say that all the time. A slow, deep chuckle rumbled in his chest. He shook his head, a look of pure, unadulterated love on his face. He set both their cups down on the top rail of the fence and pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, melting against his chest, her head finding its familiar place just under his chin. His arms wrapped around her, strong and sure, a safe harbor. She wrapped her own arms around his waist, holding him tight. The wind, that constant whining voice of the plains, picked up, a gentle morning breeze. It sighed through the new strands of barbed wire on the fence, and the metal hummed, not with the sound of a boundary or a warning, but with a low, melodic song. It was a strange, hauntingly beautiful music, the sound of a healed and mended land. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, 2 scarred and resilient souls who had found their home, listening to the wire sing in the wind. Later that day, May was clearing out the small room she had been given, now undeniably hers. She opened a small wooden chest where she kept her few belongings. At the bottom was the rough homespun scarf she had used for so long to hide her face. She picked it up, the fabric coarse and familiar in her hands. It had been her shield, her wall against a cruel world, but she did not need it anymore. She walked to the small hook on the back of her door, the hook where her work hat usually hung. With a slow, deliberate motion, she hung the scarf there. It was a surrender, not of defeat, but of a war that had finally been won. She turned and caught her reflection in the small, wavy mirror above the wash basin. The morning light streamed through the window, falling across her face. It illuminated the silvered, jagged lines of her scar. Not as a flaw, not as a mark of shame, but as a part of the landscape of her face, as intricate and unique as a river delta seen from a great height. It was a part of her story, a testament to the fire she had walked through. It was beautiful, and she knew it. The seasons would turn, the drought might not break, the cattle would still need tending, and life on the plains would always be a struggle. But the future of Sierra Blanca and of the Remington Ranch was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of how to live. The house was built, their voices were strong, and together, they were ready for whatever came next. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.